The morning sun cast golden shadows across the manicured lawns of Thornfield Palace, its rays dancing through the crystal-clear air of what promised to be a perfect summer day. Isabella Roslin stood before her bedroom mirror, her fingers trembling slightly as she attempted to tame her rebellious auburn curls into something resembling the fashionable styles worn by other ladies of society. No matter how many pins she used or how much pomade she applied, her hair seemed determined to spring free in wild, natural waves that caught the light like burnished copper. "Oh, Isabella, you look lovely," her mother, Countess Eleanor Ashworth, said softly from the doorway, though Isabella could detect the note of worried resignation in her voice. Eleanor's graying hair was perfectly coiffed, her violet dress understated but elegant. Everything about her appearance speaking to years of navigating society's expectations with quiet dignity. Isabella turned from the mirror, smoothing the simple sea-green silk of her dress. It was beautiful in its simplicity, but she knew that beside the elaborate confections worn by other young ladies, she would appear woefully underdressed. "Mother, perhaps I shouldn't attend today's garden party. I could claim a headache. Nonsense." Eleanor approached her daughter, gently tucking a loose curl behind Isabella's ear. "You have every right to be there. Your father was a respected viscount, and you are as well-bred as any of those girls." She paused, her gentle eyes meeting Isabella's emerald gaze. "Though I do worry about Lady Victoria and her circle. They can be unkind." Isabella had experienced Lady Victoria Sterling's particular brand of cruelty many times before. The golden-haired beauty with her perfect porcelain features and cruel blue eyes seemed to take special pleasure in pointing out everything that made Isabella different from the accepted standard of feminine perfection. Too many freckles, hair too wild, figure too natural, opinions too freely expressed. The carriage ride to Thornfield Palace was filled with the nervous energy that always preceded these social gatherings. Through the window, Isabella watched the countryside roll by, noting the wildflowers growing freely in the meadows, their untamed beauty a stark contrast to the carefully cultivated gardens they were approaching. Thornfield Palace rose before them like something from a fairy tale, its honey-colored stone walls gleaming in the summer sun, towers reaching toward the cloudless blue sky. But it was the gardens that truly took Isabella's breath away. Acres of perfectly manicured lawns stretched in all directions, punctuated by elaborate flower beds where roses of every imaginable color bloomed in magnificent profusion. Marble fountains sent crystalline streams of water arcing through the air, creating tiny rainbows in the sunlight. Elegant gazebos draped with climbing roses provided intimate seating areas, while broad pathways lined with topiary animals invited leisurely strolls. The garden party was already in full swing as Isabella and her mother descended from their modest carriage. Ladies in elaborate gowns of silk and satin moved like colorful butterflies among the flowers, their parasols creating patches of shade as they gossiped and laughed. Gentlemen in perfectly tailored morning coats and gleaming boots stood in small groups, discussing politics and business, while servants in crisp uniforms circulated with silver trays of refreshments. Isabella felt immediately out of place. Where other ladies wore gowns heavy with ribbons, lace, and jeweled embellishments, her simple sea-green dress seemed almost Quaker-like in its restraint. She had chosen to weave small white roses from her mother's garden into her partially upswept hair. But now she wondered if this natural touch would be seen as evidence of her family's reduced circumstances. "Isabella, darling." The saccharine voice belonged to Lady Victoria Sterling, who approached with her usual entourage of admirers and hangers-on. Victoria's gown was a confection of rose-pink silk, so elaborately decorated with Brussels lace and seed pearls that it must have cost more than Isabella's family spent in 6 months. Her platinum blonde hair was arranged in an impossibly complex style that had surely required hours to achieve, and her pale blue eyes glittered with malicious amusement as she took in Isabella's appearance. "How refreshingly simple you look today," Victoria continued, her voice carrying clearly across the nearby conversations. "I do admire your restraint in not attempting fashions that are beyond your means. It shows such self-awareness." The words hit their mark with surgical precision. Conversations around them began to die as other guests turned to watch the exchange, some with curiosity, others with the uncomfortable fascination people feel when witnessing cruelty. Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she lifted her chin with quiet dignity. "Thank you, Lady Victoria. I find that true elegance lies in simplicity rather than ostentation." Victoria's laugh was like the tinkling of broken glass. "Oh, my dear, you must let me introduce you to Lord Pemberton. He was just saying how much he admires practical ladies." She gestured to a portly gentleman with a graying mustache and kind but calculating eyes. Lord Henry Pemberton was well into his 40s, a widower known more for his substantial holdings than his charm, and Isabella was painfully aware that her modest inheritance made her an attractive prospect for men seeking to consolidate wealth rather than find love. Miss Rosalind, Lord Pemberton bowed with practiced courtesy, though his eyes assessed her like a prize heifer at market. I was hoping for the pleasure of your company for the first dance. Before Isabella could respond, a shadow fell across their small group, and the temperature seemed to drop several degrees, despite the warm summer air. Conversations didn't just quiet, they ceased entirely, as if someone had cast a spell of silence over the entire gathering. Alexander Blackthorne, Duke of Ravenswood, stood before them like a figure carved from marble in midnight. At 28, he was in the prime of his life. Tall and broad-shouldered, with raven-black hair swept back from a face that could have been sculpted by Michelangelo. His eyes were the color of winter seas, cold and penetrating, seeming to see straight through to one's soul. He was dressed with impeccable precision in a black morning coat that emphasized his powerful frame, a silver-embroidered waistcoat that spoke of wealth beyond imagination, and white gloves that had never known a day's honest work. The Duke of Ravenswood was a man whispered about in drawing-rooms and feared in business circles. They called him the Ice Duke, for his ability to destroy reputations and fortunes with nothing more than a raised eyebrow or a carefully chosen word. No one knew what had made him so cold, so ruthlessly efficient in his dealings, but everyone knew better than to cross him. Lord Pemberton, the Duke's voice was cultured velvet wrapped around steel. I believe you are mistaken about the first dance. Lord Pemberton's face went through several interesting color changes, settling finally on an unhealthy shade of gray. Your Grace, that is to say. Alexander's winter gaze shifted to Isabella, and for a moment she felt as though she were standing at the edge of a frozen lake, uncertain whether the ice would hold her weight. But then something extraordinary happened. The harsh lines around his eyes softened almost imperceptibly, and she caught a glimpse of something warm and human beneath the ducal mask. Miss Rosalind, his voice dropped to a tone meant only for her. Would you do me the honor of the first dance? The world seemed to stop spinning. Isabella was vaguely aware of Lady Victoria's sharp intake of breath, of Lord Pemberton's stammered retreat, of her mother's hand flying to her heart in shock. But all she could focus on was the Duke's extended hand, elegant and strong in its white glove, and the question in his eyes that seemed to ask far more than mere permission for a dance. Yes, Your Grace, the honor would be mine. As Alexander led her toward the area where couples were forming for the opening waltz, Isabella could feel the weight of every gaze in the garden. The orchestra, positioned in an ornate gazebo decorated with white ribbons and climbing roses, began the opening strains of a Viennese waltz, the music floating across the flower-scented air like a dream made audible. Alexander's hand settled at her waist with perfect propriety, yet Isabella felt as though lightning had struck her. His other hand clasped hers with gentle firmness, and suddenly they were moving, spinning across the makeshift dance floor with a grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics. He led with confident authority, and Isabella found herself following his steps as naturally as breathing. You dance beautifully, he murmured, his breath warm against her ear as they turned beneath the summer sun. You sound surprised, Your Grace. Isabella's natural spirit began to reassert itself now that the initial shock was wearing off. Did you expect me to stumble and disgrace you before all these fine people? Something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. On the contrary, Miss Rosalind, I expected exactly this. This? Grace, dignity, a refusal to be diminished by small minds and smaller spirits. Isabella's step faltered slightly at the unexpected praise, but Alexander's steady guidance kept her moving smoothly through the dance. Around them, other couples joined the waltz, but Isabella was barely aware of them. The Duke's presence seemed to create a bubble of intimacy that shut out the rest of the world. Why did you ask me to dance? She found herself asking, then immediately regretted the question. It sounded too much like she was fishing for compliments. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his steps never faltering as he guided her through a complex turn that left her breathless and dizzy in the most wonderful way. Because, he said finally, I am tired of dancing with women who have nothing interesting to say beyond discussions of weather and fashion. Because I watched you handle Lady Victoria's cruelty with more dignity than she has ever shown in her privileged life. And because, double quotes, he paused, his eyes meeting hers with startling intensity. Because when I look at you, Miss Rosalind, I see something real in a world full of beautiful facades. Isabella felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. But they were tears of gratitude rather than sorrow. For so long she had felt invisible, or worse, visible only as an object of ridicule. To be seen, truly seen by someone like Alexander Blackthorne, was a gift she had never dared to hope for. The waltz came to an end far too soon, and as the music faded, the spell that had surrounded them began to lift. Alexander bowed formally over her hand, pressing his lips briefly to her gloved knuckles in a gesture that sent shivers up Isabella's spine. "Miss Rosalind, would you perhaps care to take a turn through the rose garden? I find myself in need of quieter surroundings." Isabella nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. As Alexander offered his arm and began to escort her away from the main gathering, she was acutely aware of the whispers that followed in their wake. Lady Victoria's face was a mask of barely controlled fury, while Lord Pemberton looked as though he had swallowed something disagreeable. Other guests had formed small clusters, their fans fluttering as they speculated wildly about what had just transpired. The rose garden was a wonderland of color and fragrance, with varieties Isabella had only read about in botanical texts. Deep crimson blooms climbed trellises heavy with morning dew, while delicate pink varieties spilled from ornamental urns with wild abandon. The air was thick with perfume, made magical by the warm summer breeze that carried the scent in gentle waves. "You know a great deal about roses," Alexander observed as Isabella paused to examine a particularly unusual variety with petals that shifted from cream to deep rose at the edges. "I enjoy botany. My father had an extensive library, and I was permitted to read whatever interested me." Isabella colored slightly, realizing she might have revealed too much about her unconventional education. "Permitted?" Alexander's eyebrow rose with what looked like amusement rather than disapproval. How progressive of him. "Most men believe education ruins a woman for marriage, and what do you believe, Your Grace?" Alexander stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "I believe, Miss Rosalind, that an intelligent woman is infinitely more interesting than a beautiful fool. I believe that a mind capable of growth and curiosity is worth more than all the shallow accomplishments that pass for feminine education in our circles." Isabella stared at him in wonder. Everything she had heard about the Ice Duke suggested a man who was cold, calculating, concerned only with power and position. Yet here he stood, speaking to her with more respect and understanding than she had received from most people in her entire life. "You don't know me, Your Grace. For all you know, I could be exactly the sort of person you despise. Petty, small-minded, concerned only with social advancement." Alexander's smile was slow and devastating. "Could you be, Miss Rosalind?" Isabella considered the question seriously, as she did all things. "I don't think so. At least I hope not. I try to judge people by their actions rather than their circumstances. And I try to find beauty in unexpected places." She gestured toward a wild rose that had somehow seated itself at the base of a perfectly manicured hedge, its simple, five-petaled blooms a stark contrast to the elaborate cultivated varieties surrounding it. "Like that little wild rose, exactly. It doesn't belong here, according to the gardener's plan. But it adds something the planned garden lacks: spontaneity, naturalness, a reminder that beauty doesn't always follow rules." Alexander reached out and carefully plucked one of the small wild roses, handling it with surprising gentleness for such large, powerful hands. "It's rather like yourself, Miss Rosalind." Before Isabella could respond to this unexpected compliment, they were interrupted by the sound of rapidly approaching footsteps on the gravel path. Lady Victoria appeared around a bend in the path, her elaborate gown making soft rustling sounds against the rose bushes. Her face was flushed with exertion and barely contained rage. "Your Grace." Victoria's voice had lost its usual honeyed sweetness, replaced by something sharper and more desperate. "I've been looking everywhere for you. The Duchess of Marlborough was asking specifically about you, and I promised to bring you to her immediately." It was clearly a lie, but a socially acceptable one. Alexander's expression didn't change, but Isabella sensed a subtle shift in his posture, as though he were preparing for battle. "How thoughtful of you, Lady Victoria. However, Miss Rosalind and I were engaged in a most enlightening conversation about botanical specimens. Perhaps you could give the Duchess my regrets?" Victoria's eyes flashed dangerously. "Oh, but Your Grace, surely you don't wish to spend the entire afternoon discussing flowers when there are so many more important people who would value your attention." The insult was thinly veiled but unmistakable. Isabella felt her cheeks burn, but before she could respond, Alexander stepped slightly forward, his movements subtle but unmistakably protective. "Lady Victoria," his voice dropped to a tone that would have frozen champagne. "I find myself curious about your definition of importance. In my experience, people who feel compelled to diminish others in order to elevate themselves are usually the least important people in any room." Victoria's face went white, then red, then white again. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again like a fish gasping for air. Isabella almost felt sorry for her. Almost. That is..." Your Grace, I never meant to imply ... double quotes. Of course you did. Alexander's tone was conversational now, but no less dangerous for its casual delivery. You meant exactly what you said, and I suspect this is not the first time you have attempted to elevate yourself by standing on someone else's dignity. I find such behavior ... tiresome. With that single word, tiresome, the Duke of Ravenswood had just destroyed Lady Victoria Sterling's social standing. In their world, to be dismissed as tiresome by someone of Alexander's rank and influence was social death. Victoria would find invitations becoming scarce, suitors losing interest, her opinions discounted before she even spoke them. Victoria seemed to understand this immediately. Tears of rage and humiliation began to gather in her blue eyes. But she retained enough sense not to make the situation worse by arguing. With a stiff curtsy that was just barely respectful enough to avoid giving additional offense, she turned and fled back toward the main party, her elaborate gown rustling with her haste. Isabella stood in stunned silence watching Victoria's retreat. She had never seen anyone defend her so completely, so devastatingly. She turned to Alexander, searching his face for some explanation. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did." Alexander's expression was grim. "I have spent years watching people like Lady Victoria use cruelty as entertainment, and I have remained silent because it was not my business. But when she attempted to diminish you in my presence, it became my business. But the social consequences will be precisely what Lady Victoria deserves." Alexander's voice softened as he looked at Isabella. "You have done nothing wrong, Miss Rosalind. You have comported yourself with grace and dignity while others have behaved like children. If society cannot recognize that, then perhaps society needs to be reminded of what true nobility looks like." They continued their walk through the gardens, but the mood had shifted. Isabella found herself stealing glances at her companion, trying to reconcile the cold, feared Duke of Ravenswood with the man who had just defended her honor with such devastating efficiency. He seemed lost in thought, his jaw set with determination, and Isabella wondered what calculations were running through his mind. "Your Grace," she ventured finally, "may I ask you something rather personal? You may ask." "I reserve the right not to answer." Isabella smiled at his honesty. "Why are you called the Ice Duke? You don't seem particularly cold to me." Alexander was quiet for so long that Isabella began to think he wouldn't answer. They had reached a secluded section of the garden where ancient oak trees created natural alcoves, filled with shade and the soft sound of rustling leaves. Finally he spoke. "I learned early in life that showing emotion is seen as weakness by those who would exploit it. My father died when I was 16, leaving me to inherit not just his title but his responsibilities. There were men who thought they could manipulate a grieving boy, take advantage of his inexperience." Alexander's voice was matter-of-fact, but Isabella could hear the old pain underneath. "I discovered that coldness, calculated, implacable coldness, was an effective shield against such people. And now it has become so much a part of me that most people see nothing else." He turned to look at her, and Isabella was startled by the vulnerability she saw in his winter blue eyes. "You are the first person in years to look at me and see something other than ice." Isabella felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. "What do I see? You tell me." Isabella considered the question seriously, studying his face in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the oak leaves. "I see someone who has learned to protect himself by building walls, but who hasn't forgotten how to care about others. I see strength, but also loneliness. I see a man who is tired of being feared and would prefer to be understood." Alexander was very still for a moment, and Isabella wondered if she had overstepped, revealed too much of what she thought she saw in him. Then, slowly, he smiled. Not the polite social smile she had seen him wear at the party, but something warmer and more genuine. "You see a great deal, Miss Rosalind." "Isabella," she said impulsively. "When we're alone like this, would you call me Isabella?" "Isabella." He spoke her name like he was tasting it, testing its weight on his tongue. "It suits you." Strong, but with music in it. They had stopped walking entirely now, standing facing each other in the green shadows of the oak grove. Isabella was acutely aware of how alone they were, how improper this situation would be considered by society standards. A young, unmarried woman alone with a man, no chaperone in sight, engaged in intimate conversation. It was exactly the sort of situation that led to scandal and ruined reputations. But Isabella found she didn't care. For the first time in her life, she was having a real conversation with someone who saw her as she truly was, someone who didn't dismiss her thoughts or mock her appearance. The rest of the world, with all its rules and expectations, seemed very far away. Alexander, she said, testing his name as he had tested hers. Thank you for this afternoon. For the dance. For defending me. For seeing me, Isabella. His voice was rough with emotion. I need you to understand something. What happened today? Am I asking you to dance the way I spoke to Lady Victoria? It will have consequences. People will talk. They will speculate about my intentions, about your character. Are you prepared for that? Isabella thought about her life before this afternoon, the casual cruelties, the social isolation, the assumption that she would eventually settle for someone like Lord Pemberton because no one better would want her. Then she thought about the past hour, about feeling valued and seen and defended by someone extraordinary. Yes, she said simply. Whatever comes, it will be worth it. Alexander stepped closer, close enough that Isabella could see the flecks of silver in his blue eyes, close enough to breathe in the subtle scent of his cologne mixed with summer roses. For a moment she thought he might kiss her, and she realized she wanted him to with a fierceness that surprised her. Instead, he reached out and gently tucked the wild rose he had picked earlier into her hair, his fingers brushing against her cheek in the process. "My wild rose," he murmured, his voice so low she almost didn't catch the words. The spell was broken by the sound of approaching voices and footsteps. Alexander stepped back immediately, restoring proper distance between them just as Isabella's mother appeared on the path, accompanied by a young gentleman Isabella didn't recognize. "Isabella, there you are." Eleanor's voice was carefully controlled, but Isabella could see the worry in her eyes. "I was beginning to wonder where you had gotten to." "Your Grace," Eleanor continued, offering a perfect curtsy to Alexander. "I hope my daughter has not been monopolizing your time. On the contrary, Lady Ashworth. Miss Rosalind has provided me with the most pleasant company I have enjoyed in years." Alexander's formal mask was back in place, but his words were warm enough to bring a smile to Eleanor's face. The young gentleman with Eleanor stepped forward with an eager smile. "Your Grace, I am Thomas Hartwell, Viscount Ashford. I was hoping for an introduction to the young lady who has captured the attention of all London this afternoon." Isabella blinked in confusion. All London? But she had done nothing except dance once and walk in the gardens. Alexander's expression grew amused. "Lord Ashford, may I present Miss Isabella Rosalind, Isabella." Lord Ashford has recently returned from his grand tour of the continent. As Thomas bowed over her hand with obvious admiration, Isabella began to understand what Alexander had meant about consequences. By singling her out for his attention, the Duke of Ravenswood had elevated her from social outcast to object of fascination. Other young men would now see her not as the plain, unfashionable daughter of an impoverished viscount, but as a woman worthy of ducal attention. The walk back to the main party proved this theory correct. Where before Isabella had been ignored or actively avoided, now she found herself surrounded by curious faces and eager conversation. Ladies who had never spoken to her before suddenly wanted to discuss fashion and literature. Gentlemen appeared at her elbow, offering to fetch refreshments or requesting the honor of future dances. Isabella handled the attention with as much grace as she could muster, but she felt overwhelmed by the sudden transformation in her social standing. Through it all, she remained acutely aware of Alexander's presence, even when he was on the opposite side of the garden engaged in conversation with other guests. It was as though some invisible thread connected them, making her conscious of his every movement. As the afternoon wore on, Isabella found herself partnered for several more dances. Lord Ashford proved to be an entertaining companion, full of amusing stories from his travels. Another young gentleman, Mr. Charles Weatherby, engaged her in a spirited discussion about literature that revealed a sharp mind and genuine appreciation for her intelligence. For the first time in her life, Isabella experienced what it was like to be popular, sought after, valued for her conversation as much as her company. But through it all, she found her thoughts returning to those quiet moments in the oak grove, to the feeling of Alexander's fingers brushing her cheek as he placed the wild rose in her hair, to the way he had looked at her as though she were something precious and rare. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the gardens, Isabella noticed a commotion near the main entrance to the palace. A magnificent carriage had arrived, drawn by 4 perfectly matched black horses, and bearing a coat of arms that made several guests immediately bow deeply. "The Duke of Marlborough," someone whispered nearby, "and the Duchess is with him." Isabella watched as an elderly gentleman of obvious importance descended from the carriage, followed by a regal woman whose bearing proclaimed her nobility from 100 yards away. She noticed Alexander immediately detach himself from his current conversation and move toward the new arrivals with purposeful strides. "The Duke of Marlborough is Alexander's godfather," Eleanor said quietly, appearing at Isabella's elbow. "A very powerful man and not one to cross." Isabella watched with growing unease as Alexander greeted the elderly Duke with obvious affection and respect. The three of them, Alexander, the Duke, and the Duchess, formed a tight conversation group that seemed to exclude everyone else. Isabella couldn't hear what was being said, but she could see the Duchess gesturing in her direction more than once. And the Duke of Marlborough's expression grew increasingly stern as the conversation progressed. Miss Rosalind, a familiar, unpleasant voice spoke behind her. Isabella turned to find Lady Victoria approaching, her earlier humiliation apparently forgotten in favor of what looked like vindictive satisfaction. Lady Victoria. Isabella kept her voice politely neutral. I thought you should know, Victoria's voice was sickeningly sweet, that the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough are discussing your situation with His Grace. It seems they have concerns about the appropriateness of his attentions to someone so far beneath his station. Isabella felt as though someone had poured ice water into her veins. I'm sure I don't know what you mean. Oh, my dear, don't be naive. Everyone is talking about it. The Duke of Ravenswood dancing with the impoverished daughter of a minor viscount, walking alone with her in the gardens. It's quite the scandal. And now his godfather has arrived to remind him of his duties to his name and his future. Victoria's blue eyes glittered with malicious pleasure. I do hope you haven't allowed yourself to develop unrealistic expectations. Before Isabella could respond, Victoria had glided away, leaving her standing frozen in the midst of the garden party. Around her, conversations continued, laughter rang out, and the orchestra played cheerful melodies. But Isabella felt suddenly detached from it all, as though she were watching the scene through glass. She forced herself to look toward the group where Alexander stood with the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough. As she watched, the Duchess placed a possessive hand on Alexander's arm and leaned close to speak directly into his ear. Alexander's expression was unreadable, but Isabella thought she saw his shoulders tense almost imperceptibly. Isabella, dear, are you quite all right? Eleanor appeared at her side, concern evident in her voice. You've gone quite pale. I think perhaps we should leave soon, Mother. I'm beginning to feel rather tired. Eleanor studied her daughter's face with the keen perception that only mothers possess. Has someone said something to upset you? Isabella managed a small smile. Nothing that I shouldn't have expected, Mother. I think I simply forgot myself for a moment. But even as she spoke the words, Isabella felt a spark of her natural spirit reasserting itself. She had done nothing wrong. She had accepted a dance from a gentleman who asked her, engaged in proper conversation, and conducted herself with perfect propriety. If society found fault with that, then perhaps the fault lay with society rather than with her. As if sensing her thoughts, Alexander looked across the garden at that moment, his eyes finding hers with unerring accuracy. Even at this distance, Isabella could see something in his expression that made her pulse quicken determination, perhaps, or defiance. He said something brief to his companions, then began walking deliberately in her direction. The crowd seemed to part before him like the Red Sea, conversations dying and heads turning to follow his progress. The Duke of Marlborough called out something sharp behind him, but Alexander didn't pause or look back. His attention was entirely focused on Isabella, and his expression was that of a man who had come to a decision. Miss Rosalind, he said when he reached her, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush that had fallen over the nearby guests. I believe I promised you a tour of the palace's famous rose collection. Would you care to see it now? It was a public invitation, issued in front of dozens of witnesses, impossible to misinterpret as anything other than a clear statement of his intentions. By asking her to accompany him on a formal tour of the palace, Alexander was declaring that he found her company not just acceptable, but preferable to that of every other lady present. Isabella was aware of the collective intake of breath from the watching crowd, of Lady Victoria's face going white with shock, of the Duke of Marlborough's thunderous expression. But most of all, she was aware of Alexander's eyes, steady and sure, asking her to trust him, to take this leap of faith with him. I would be honored, Your Grace, she replied, placing her gloved hand on his offered arm. As they walked together toward the palace, leaving a garden full of shocked whispers and speculation behind them, Isabella felt as though she were stepping into an entirely new life. Whatever happened next, whatever consequences arose from this afternoon, she knew she would never again be the invisible girl who accepted cruelty as her due. The palace's interior was even more magnificent than its gardens, with soaring ceilings painted with elaborate frescoes, walls lined with priceless artwork and furnishings that spoke of centuries of accumulated wealth and power. But Isabella barely noticed the splendor around her, too conscious of Alexander's presence beside her, of the way he seemed to create a space of calm in the midst of chaos. The rose collection is this way, he said, guiding her down a corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. Though I confess I have an ulterior motive in bringing you here. Which is, Alexander stopped before a pair of ornate double doors and turned to face her. Privacy, for what I need to say to you. He opened the doors to reveal a magnificent conservatory, its glass walls and ceiling filled with the warm light of the setting sun. Rose bushes and elaborate planters lined the space, their blooms creating a riot of color and fragrance that was almost overwhelming in its beauty. It was like stepping into a fairy tale, a glass palace filled with flowers and golden light. But Isabella's attention was entirely focused on Alexander's face, on the intensity of his expression as he closed the doors behind them, ensuring their privacy. Isabella, he began, then stopped, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair in a gesture that was charmingly human. I am not a man given to impulsive actions. Every decision I make is calculated, weighed, considered from every angle. But today, Today I find myself prepared to act purely on instinct, to ignore every rule of propriety and social expectation, because I have met someone who makes me remember what it feels like to be truly alive. Isabella's heart began to pound so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it in the quiet conservatory. Alexander, what are you saying? He stepped closer, his hands reaching out to frame her face with gentle reverence. I'm saying that in the space of one afternoon you have turned my entire world upside down. I'm saying that I don't care what the Duke of Marlborough thinks, or what society expects, or what anyone else believes is appropriate. I am saying that I have spent years being the Ice Duke, and I am tired of being cold. His thumbs brushed across her cheekbones with infinite tenderness. I am saying that I want to court you properly, Isabella Rosalind. I want to call on you tomorrow, and the next day, and every day after that, until you are so tired of my presence that you agree to marry me just to have some peace. Isabella felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. Alexander, are you certain? The consequences will be exactly what we make of them. His voice was firm with conviction. I am a duke, Isabella. I have power, influence, wealth beyond imagining. I can weather any social storm, overcome any obstacle, silence any criticism. The only thing I cannot do is go back to the way things were before I met you. Isabella searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt or hesitation. She found none. The Duke of Ravenswood, the man feared throughout London for his cold calculation and ruthless efficiency, was looking at her with an expression of such tender hope that it took her breath away. What about Lady Victoria? What about Lord Pemberton? What about everyone who expects you to marry someone more, suitable? Alexander's smile was warm and devastating. What about them? Lady Victoria is beautiful and accomplished and utterly vapid. Lord Pemberton is a fortune-hunting bore who would make you miserable. And everyone else who thinks they know what's suitable for me can go hang. I don't want suitable, Isabella. I want you. The last word was spoken with such fierce conviction that Isabella felt her last defenses crumble. This was really happening. The most eligible bachelor in England, the man who could have his pick of any woman in society, was asking to court her plain, unfashionable, impoverished Isabella Rosalind. Yes, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own racing heart. Yes, Alexander. I would very much like that. Alexander's smile was like the sun coming out after a long winter. He leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was gentle, reverent, and absolutely perfect. It lasted only a moment, but Isabella knew she would remember it for the rest of her life, her first kiss, in a palace conservatory filled with roses, with the man who had seen past her plain exterior to the person she truly was. When they broke apart, Alexander rested his forehead against hers, his breathing slightly uneven. There, he said softly, now it's official. You belong to me, Isabella, and I to you. Let society make of that what it will. They stood together in the golden light of the conservatory for several precious minutes, neither wanting to break the spell that surrounded them. But eventually the sounds of the garden party filtering through the glass walls reminded them that they could not hide away forever. We should return, Alexander said reluctantly. Your reputation has taken enough risks for one afternoon. Isabella laughed, surprising herself with the sound. My reputation was hardly sterling to begin with. I think I can survive a little more scandal. Perhaps, but I cannot survive being the cause of any harm to you. Alexander's expression grew serious. There will be talk, Isabella. Vicious, cruel talk designed to make you question your worth and my sincerity. You must promise me that you will not listen to it. And if the talk proves too much, if your godfather forbids the match, if society turns against us entirely, Alexander's jaw set with familiar determination, then we shall weather it together. I am not a man who changes his mind, Isabella. When I commit to something or someone, it is with everything I have. They walked back through the palace corridors in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what the future might hold. As they approached the conservatory doors that led back to the garden, Alexander paused and turned to Isabella one more time. "Before we go back," he said quietly, "I want you to remember something. No matter what happens out there, no matter what anyone says or does, what we have discovered today is real. You are the woman who has captured my heart, and I am the man who will spend his life proving worthy of yours." Isabella smiled up at him with new confidence. "Then let's go show them what real nobility looks like." The garden party was still in full swing when they emerged from the palace, but the atmosphere had distinctly shifted. Conversations stopped abruptly as they appeared. Fans fluttered with increased urgency, and Isabella could feel the weight of dozens of curious and hostile gazes. The Duke of Marlborough stood near the main entrance, his expression thunderous as he watched Alexander escort Isabella back into the gathering. Beside him, the Duchess wore a look of cold disapproval that could have frozen champagne. They were clearly waiting for Alexander to approach them, to explain himself, to perhaps apologize for his unconventional behavior. Instead, Alexander led Isabella directly to where her mother stood with a small group of ladies, all of whom seemed to be engaged in animated speculation about the afternoon's events. "Lady Ashworth," Alexander said with perfect formality, "I hope you will not think me presumptuous, but I would very much like to call upon you and Miss Rosalind tomorrow afternoon, if it would be convenient." Eleanor's eyes widened slightly, but her years of navigating society's complexities served her well. "Of course, Your Grace. We would be honored to receive you." "Excellent. Shall we say 3 o'clock? 3 o'clock would be perfect." Alexander bowed formally to Eleanor, then turned to Isabella. "Miss Rosalind, thank you for a most enlightening afternoon. I look forward to continuing our conversation tomorrow." Isabella curtsied with equal formality, though her eyes sparkled with shared understanding. "The pleasure was entirely mine, Your Grace." It was a perfectly proper exchange, witnessed by multiple members of society, establishing Alexander's serious intentions beyond any doubt. By requesting permission to call formally, he had declared his interest in courtship as clearly as if he had announced it in the London papers. The effect was immediate and electric. The ladies surrounding Eleanor began to chatter excitedly, their attitudes toward Isabella transforming before her eyes from condescension to eager friendliness. Gentlemen who had ignored her entirely just hours before suddenly appeared at her elbow, requesting introductions and future dances. But through it all, Isabella remained aware of the darker undercurrents swirling through the gathering. Lady Victoria stood with a group of her friends, their heads bent together in what was clearly malicious gossip. Lord Pemberton looked as though he had swallowed something particularly unpleasant, and the Duke of Marlborough's expression grew progressively more severe as he watched the scene unfold. Finally, Alexander could avoid the confrontation no longer. With a brief, reassuring glance at Isabella, he strode across the garden to where his godfather waited with barely controlled anger. "Uncle," Alexander said quietly, using the informal address that acknowledged their close family connection despite the lack of blood relation. "Alexander," the Duke of Marlborough's voice was clipped, controlled, but edged with steel. "I believe we need to have a private conversation." "Indeed we do. But not here, and not now. Tomorrow morning, if it suits you." "It does not suit me. It suits me to have this conversation immediately." Alexander's expression didn't change, but Isabella could see the subtle shift in his posture that indicated he was preparing for battle. "Nevertheless, uncle, it will wait until tomorrow. I will not have Miss Rosalind's name dragged through a public argument, nor will I discuss my private affairs in front of half of London society." The elderly duke's face flushed with anger. "Your private affairs ceased to be private the moment you made a spectacle of yourself with that ... girl." The insult hung in the air between them like a drawn sword. Isabella felt as though every person in the garden was holding their breath, waiting to see how Alexander would respond to this direct challenge to his judgment. When Alexander spoke, his voice was quiet, conversational, and absolutely deadly. "Uncle, I suggest you choose your next words very carefully. Miss Rosalind is a lady of good family and impeccable character, and she will be treated with the respect due to any woman I choose to honor with my attention. Any suggestion to the contrary will be met with the full force of my displeasure." It was a warning that carried the weight of Alexander's title, his fortune, and his considerable influence. The Duke of Marlborough might be his godfather, but Alexander was now the head of his own family, master of his own estates, and answerable to no one but himself. The elderly duke seemed to recognize this, though his expression remained furious. "Very well. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. My study. 11 o'clock. My study." It was a subtle but important distinction. By insisting the meeting take place on his own territory, Alexander was asserting his independence and his authority. The Duke of Marlborough's jaw worked furiously, but he eventually gave a curt nod. Alexander returned to Isabella's side without another glance at his godfather, his expression serene as though nothing untoward had occurred. "Is everything all right?" Isabella asked quietly. "Everything is perfect," Alexander replied, and his smile was warm enough to melt the ice around any heart. "Shall I escort you and your mother to your carriage? I believe you've had quite enough excitement for one afternoon." The drive home passed in a blur of Eleanor's excited chatter and Isabella's dazed contemplation of the day's extraordinary events. It wasn't until they were safely back in their modest London townhouse that the full reality of the situation began to sink in. "Isabella," Eleanor said as they sat in their small but comfortable parlor, "do you realize what has happened today? The Duke of Ravenswood has asked permission to court you. This could change everything for our family." Isabella nodded absently, her fingers touching the wild rose that Alexander had placed in her hair and that she had carefully preserved throughout the afternoon. "I know, Mother, but I need you to understand this isn't about improving our social position or securing an advantageous match. This is about something much more important than that." Eleanor studied her daughter's face with growing comprehension. "You care for him, truly care for him." "I think I might love him," Isabella admitted quietly. "Is that terribly foolish of me? Fall in love with a man I've known for less than a day? Love rarely follows the rules of logic, darling. Your father and I knew within hours of meeting that we were meant to be together." Eleanor's expression grew wistful. "But Isabella, you must understand the challenges you'll face. The Duke is one of the most eligible men in England, and there will be many people who believe you're not worthy of his attention. They will try to destroy your confidence, to convince you that his interests cannot possibly be genuine." Isabella thought about Lady Victoria's cruel words, about the Duke of Marlborough's obvious disapproval, about all the obstacles that lay ahead. Then she thought about Alexander's hands framing her face, about the conviction in his voice when he told her she belonged to him, about the way he had defended her without hesitation. "Let them try," she said with quiet determination. "I know what I felt today, Mother. I know what I saw in his eyes. And I know that I would rather face any challenge with Alexander beside me than live a safe, comfortable life without him." Eleanor smiled and reached across to squeeze her daughter's hand. "Then we shall face whatever comes together. And tomorrow afternoon we shall receive the Duke of Ravenswood properly, as befits a man who has the good sense to recognize our Isabella's true worth." That evening, as Isabella sat at her dressing table brushing out her auburn curls before bed, she caught sight of herself in the mirror and paused. For years she had seen only her flaws when she looked at her reflection: the unruly hair, the freckles, the features that didn't conform to society's ideals of beauty. But tonight she saw something different. She saw the woman who had captured the attention of the Duke of Ravenswood, the woman who had been told she was beautiful by a man who could have his choice of any lady in England. The wild rose sat in a small vase beside her mirror, its simple beauty a reminder of the extraordinary day that had changed her life forever. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult conversations, and perhaps even heartbreak. But tonight Isabella Roslin went to sleep knowing that she was loved by the most remarkable man she had ever met, and that whatever the future held she would face it with courage and grace. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, as though the weather itself was reflecting the tension that hung over London society like a storm cloud. Isabella woke early, her stomach fluttering with nervous anticipation. Today would bring Alexander's promised visit, but it would also bring the results of his confrontation with the Duke of Marlborough. She dressed with extra care, choosing a simple but elegant morning dress of soft blue muslin that complemented her eyes and brought out the auburn highlights in her hair. Eleanor had arranged for their modest sitting room to be thoroughly cleaned and polished, and had somehow managed to procure an impressive tea service that would do justice to their ducal visitor. At precisely 11 o'clock, as Isabella was arranging flowers in the sitting room, they heard the sound of an impressive carriage arriving outside their modest townhouse. Isabella rushed to the window and peered through the lace curtains to see Alexander descending from a magnificent black carriage emblazoned with his ducal coat of arms. Her heart skipped a beat at the sight of him. He was dressed impeccably in a dark blue morning coat that emphasized his broad shoulders, and his expression was calm and composed despite whatever had transpired with his godfather that morning. As he approached their front door, he looked up and caught sight of Isabella at the window. His serious expression immediately transformed into a warm smile that made her pulse race. Eleanor answered the door herself, having given their single servant the afternoon off to ensure privacy. "Your Grace, welcome to our home. Lady Ashworth, thank you for receiving me." Alexander's manner was perfectly formal, but Isabella could see the warmth in his eyes as he glanced around their modest but tasteful sitting room. "I hope I am not inconveniently early." "Not at all. Isabella has been looking forward to your visit all morning." Alexander's gaze found Isabella across the room, and she felt that familiar spark of connection that seemed to ignite whenever they looked at each other. "Miss Rosalind, you look lovely this afternoon." "Thank you, Your Grace." "Please, won't you sit down? Mother has prepared tea." As they settled into the comfortable ritual of afternoon tea, Isabella found herself studying Alexander's face for signs of strain or worry. Whatever had happened during his meeting with the Duke of Marlborough, he showed no obvious effects of it. "Your Grace," Eleanor said carefully as she poured tea from their best china service, "I hope your morning was pleasant." Alexander's smile was wry. "Educational, certainly. My godfather has some very strong opinions about appropriate matrimonial alliances." Isabella felt her heart sink. "And did those opinions influence your intentions?" Alexander set down his teacup and leaned forward slightly, his expression intensely serious. "Isabella, I want you to understand something clearly. Nothing, not my godfather's disapproval, not society's expectations, not the opinion of every person in London, will change what I told you yesterday. I meant every word." Relief flooded through Isabella so powerfully that she felt dizzy. "But surely the Duke of Marlborough's opinion carries weight with you. He is family, after all. He is family, and I love him dearly, but I am no longer a 16-year-old boy in need of guidance. I am a grown man, fully capable of making my own decisions about my future." Alexander's voice carried quiet authority. "I told him that I intend to court you properly, with an eye toward marriage if you will have me. I told him that my decision is final and not open to discussion or negotiation." Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly. How did he respond to that declaration? Alexander's smile was rueful. "About as well as you might expect. There was some discussion of duty, of bloodlines, of political alliances that could be formed through more strategic marriages. I believe the word unsuitable was used more than once." Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Perhaps he's right." "Perhaps suitable for someone of your rank, Isabella." Alexander's voice was sharp enough to make her look up at him immediately. "Do not let anyone, not even someone I love and respect, convince you that you are less than you are. You are intelligent, kind, courageous, and beautiful. You have brought more joy into my life in 2 days than I have experienced in years. If that is unsuitable, then I am happy to be unsuitable along with you." The conviction in his voice left no room for doubt. Eleanor smiled approvingly, and Isabella felt her confidence beginning to reassert itself. "What happens now?" Isabella asked quietly. "Now we proceed exactly as I promised we would. I will call on you regularly with your mother's permission. I will escort you to appropriate social functions. I will court you properly and thoroughly until either you grow tired of my company or agree to become my wife." Eleanor cleared her throat delicately. "Your Grace, you must understand that such a courtship will not go unnoticed. There will be talk, speculation, perhaps even attempts to discredit Isabella's character." "There will indeed," Alexander agreed grimly. "But there will also be my protection, my influence, and my very clear displeasure with anyone who treats Isabella with anything less than complete respect. I have found that most people prefer to avoid my displeasure." Isabella thought about Lady Victoria's devastation the day before, about the way Alexander's quiet words had destroyed her social standing with surgical precision. The Ice Duke's reputation for ruthlessness would indeed provide powerful protection. "Are you certain you want to face such challenges for me?" Isabella asked, needing to hear his answer one more time. Alexander rose from his chair and moved to kneel beside hers, taking her hands in his with gentle reverence. "Isabella, you are not a challenge to be faced. You are a prize to be won, a treasure to be protected, a gift I never expected to receive. I would face down the entire British Army for the chance to call you mine." Isabella felt tears spring to her eyes at the fierce tenderness in his voice. "Alexander... Say yes, Isabella. Say you'll let me court you properly. Say you'll give me the chance to prove that we belong together." Isabella looked into his winter blue eyes and saw her entire future reflected there, future filled with love, respect, challenge, and adventure beyond anything she had ever dared to dream. "Yes," she whispered, her voice strong despite her tears. "Yes, Alexander. I would be honored to accept your courtship." Alexander brought her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles that sent shivers up her spine. Then it settled. "You are officially mine to protect and cherish, and I am officially yours to command and reform." Eleanor laughed softly. "I believe this calls for a toast, to new beginnings and brave hearts." As they raised their teacups in celebration, Isabella felt as though her entire world had been transformed. Yesterday she had been the plain, overlooked daughter of an impoverished viscount. Today she was the beloved of the most powerful duke in England, embarking on a courtship that would either elevate her to heights she had never imagined or destroy them both in spectacular fashion. But as she looked at Alexander's face, saw the love and determination there, Isabella realized she was no longer afraid of whatever challenges lay ahead. With him beside her, she felt capable of conquering the world, or at least the small, narrow-minded corner of it that was London society. The future stretched before them, uncertain but bright with possibility. And Isabella Rossellin had never been happier to be exactly who she was, a wild rose who had found her perfect place in an unexpected garden, cherished and protected by a man who saw her true beauty when no one else could.